Is West Virginia constitutional? Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River. Wait a second. Is Take Me Home Country Roads actually about Virginia and not West Virginia? Is West Virginia even a thing? Hello, I'm Zachary Worrell, attorney licensed in Texas and Virginia, and today we're going to tackle an issue that's been burning at the forefront of everybody's minds for the past 161 years. Is West Virginia even a thing? Before the Civil War, Virginia looked something like this. And after the Civil War, it looked something like this. Obviously, West Virginia broke off of Virginia more or less because of the Civil War. And because the Civil War was, as Abraham Lincoln told us, about preserving the Constitution, surely West Virginia is constitutional, right? Luckily, Article 4, Section 3 deals squarely with the issue of admitting new states to the Union and creating new states out of existing ones. New states may be admitted by the Congress into this Union, nor shall any state be formed by the junction of two or more states, or parts of states, without consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. New states may be admitted by the Congress into the Union, no problem, but that second clause I read there poses a bit of a problem for West Virginia. But so long as Virginia consented to the creation of West Virginia and the Congress voted to admit West Virginia as a state, shouldn't be a problem. So, did Virginia ever actually vote to create the state of West Virginia? Well, it's complicated. Interestingly, Virginia's actually given birth to two states other than itself. Virginia started out as a colony looking something like this, and then shifted to this. And then by the time of the Revolutionary War, it looked something like this. And then, on December 18th, 1789, the Virginia legislature passed a law creating the state of Kentucky out of the former District of Kentucky. And then, on February 4th, 1791, the Congress consented to the creation of Kentucky and admitted it into the Union. Nor any state formed from parts of a state or from the junction of two or more states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned and of the Congress. Check. Check. Kentucky passes. It's constitutional. But what about West Virginia? So, as you may or may not know, in 1861, a little war broke out in the United States. Most of us call it the Civil War. Some of us call it the War of Northern Aggression. And in polite company, you might hear it referred to as the recent unpleasantness. After the election of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who ran on a platform of abolishing the spread of slavery into the new territories of the United States, the Deep South seceded from the Union. Virginia, given its historical significance in the creation of the United States, having a bunch of presidents early in its history, being the home of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Virginia was trying to keep everybody cool. In fact, Virginia rejected secession twice. However, unfortunately for everybody, the hotheads in South Carolina decided to fire on Fort Sumter, and in response, Lincoln called for the raising of an army to invade the South. Virginia saw this as a step too far, and so it called a convention to determine the question of secession. The convention voted heavily in favor of secession and decided to leave the ultimate issue of whether to secede up to a popular referendum. 30 delegates to that secession convention, however, from the far northwestern parts of Virginia, voted against secession. And then after that referendum voted in favor heavily of seceding, those delegates in the far northwestern part of Virginia decided to hold their own convention, the so-called Wheeling Convention. This Wheeling Convention voted that by authorizing secession, the government of Virginia had actually dissolved, and therefore voted that it needed to create a new government of Virginia, and that this newly reformed government of Virginia authorized the creation of a new state of West Virginia in the western parts of Virginia. So in essence, the western part of Virginia voted itself unilaterally to actually be the government of Virginia, and unilaterally voted to create the state of West Virginia. Meanwhile, the rest of the Virginia government was still meeting in Richmond, had a governor, had a legislature, all that. But this Wheeling Convention decided that, nah, we're actually the legislature of Virginia. And because these territories in western Virginia were pro-unionist, Abraham Lincoln decided it ought to be a good idea to ratify this, and the Congress did so in 1863, admitting West Virginia into the Union. Problem is, though, that there was a government of Virginia operating at the time in the actual halls of the government of Virginia with a governor, a legislature, and all that. And that government of Virginia never voted to create the state of West Virginia. So in essence, there were two governments of Virginia, the actual government of Virginia and this new reformed government of Virginia, both claimed to be the legitimate government of Virginia. So the question of whether West Virginia was ever formed constitutionally hinges on whether the reformed government of Virginia or the actual government of Virginia was the actual government of Virginia. Because only the actual government of Virginia can vote to create a new state out of its territories. Surely the Supreme Court has weighed in on this issue though, right? Wrong. The Supreme Court has tangentially considered the issue on more than one occasion. In Texas v. White, decided in 1869, the Supreme Court held that any act seceding from the Union passed by a state government agreement was null, void, and of no force or effect. And this matters because West Virginia's logic is that the secession of Virginia constituted a dissolution of the government of Virginia, and therefore it had the capacity to reform the government of Virginia and vote to create the state of West Virginia. And so if Virginia never seceded from the Union, did it ever dissolve itself? According to the Supreme Court, it seems not. But surely Virginia and West Virginia have gone to court over the question of secession, right? There's a Supreme Court case, Virginia versus West Virginia, decided in 1871. Sounds like that ought to address the issue, right? Wrong. In Virginia versus West Virginia, the Supreme Court didn't actually tackle the question of whether the creation of West Virginia was legitimate. The case was about two counties that had voted to join West Virginia under dubious circumstances. In the case, Virginia argued that because the elections were held under dubious circumstances, those counties had never actually voted to join West Virginia. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided the issue without ever deciding whether West Virginia was constitutional, and held that, yes, those counties were actually a part of West Virginia. They just assumed that West Virginia had been formed constitutionally in the first place. So no, there's never been a Supreme Court case to decide whether West Virginia was constitutional at all. But obviously, in the past 161 years since West Virginia joined the Union, Virginia has voted to create the state of West Virginia, right? Wrong. And so unlike with Kentucky, which actually has legislation on the books authorizing the creation of the state, there's no law on the books in Virginia that creates the state of West Virginia. And so if the legislature of Virginia has never voted to create the state of West Virginia, how on earth could it possibly be that West Virginia is constitutional, considering the Constitution requires that no state be formed by a part of a state without the consent of the legislature of the state concerned and by approval of the Congress. And so I say no, West Virginia technically is not constitutional. John Denver, take us home. Almost heaven, Western Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River. Much better. Thanks for watching. And while most people will never need a lawyer to determine whether the state that they live in is actually constitutional, normal people need lawyers all the time. And that's why I'm offering everybody in my audience free 30-minute consultation with an actual attorney if they use promo code OCCUPIEDVIRGINIA when signing up. And as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and click that little notification bell so that you never miss an important update.